שישו ושמחו בשמחת תורה ותנו כבוד לתורה. שישו ושמחו בשמחת תורה ותנו כבוד לתורה. שישו ושמחו בשמחת תורה ותנו כבוד לתורה. שישו ושמחו בשמחת תורה.
Shabbat Shalom. Today we have Parasha Vayetse. In this Parasha, Yaakov is fleeing his brother. He's on his way to Haran to find himself a wife and really to get away from his brother Esav. So he stops at a place called Luz, and he sees a ladder with malachim ascending and descending, and then the malach of Yehovah himself stands over him and gives him a blessing. He tells him, "Your offspring shall be as the dust of the earth, and you shall spread out powerfully westward and eastward, northward and southward. And all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you and by your offspring." Here we have Adonai himself, through his malach, giving Yaakov the same blessing that he gave to Abraham, his grandfather. And this is the Bechorah that got him in trouble with his brother in the first place. This is what he wanted. Yaakov all along wanted to receive this blessing. And before he goes out to Haran, Adonai gives him that blessing. First he got it from his father Yitzhak, and then he received it from Adonai himself. So once again, proving to us clearly that Yaakov was not just an imposter, and certainly Adonai did not see him as an imposter, something that he had stolen from his brother or had done an injustice to him. In a sense, Adonai knew that Yaakov was the brother out of the two that would value that blessing. And so here we have, Adonai gives him the blessing. Yaakov wakes up from this dream and it says, this is a Ma Noracha Makom. This is an awesome place. And he renamed that place Betel. Betel, which means house of God. So before he leaves that place, he makes a neder. He makes a vow saying, if Adonai would be with me, if he gives me clothes to wear and food to eat, and I go to this faraway land and things go well for me, I will give him a tithe repeatedly. I will constantly give him a tithe. And not to get sidetracked too much, speaking of tithes, but there is a movement, and I have heard it in my years in studying Torah and being in the Messianic movement. There is a contingency of people that speak against the tithe in the sense that they will say it's not a necessary thing to do now that there's no Bet HaMikdash, or really there's no temple, there's no tabernacle, there is no Levites to receive it. And really, technically speaking, they are correct. They really are. Now, this is why I call this the tithe of Jacob. And if we look at the concept of the ma'aser, the tithe in the Torah, we see that there are multiple tithes, and you'll read it that there is a tithe every 3 years, right? That you're supposed to rejoice with. And there's a tithe for the Levite. There's a tithe for the widow, for the orphan, right? For the stranger. There is a tithe of your grain. There is a tithe of your animal. So there are multiple tithes in the Torah, and here we see Yaakov promising to do a tithe which is none of those. It is none of the tithes mentioned in the Torah. It is strictly speaking a tithe of thankfulness, that if Adonai would bless him, he would give something back. What does that mean? What Yaakov was saying is, I will know that all blessing comes from you, that it wasn't because of my brains, it wasn't because of my strength, it wasn't because I'm very clever that I will amass any wealth that you would give me. I would know that it is because you just gave me a blessing. And this gratefulness, this tithe of gratefulness is something that we need to learn from Yaakov. We see it also from Abraham, his grandfather, when he tithed to Melchizedek. And what it means is the patriarchs were wise and humble enough to recognize that Adonai does not want people that serve him to be selfish, in the sense that everything that you made is yours. If you keep everything that you make and you don't share with Adonai in different ways, What you're saying is, everything I made belongs to me because I earned it. Not with Adonai as my business partner, but because I earned it. And what we learn is the patriarchs did not do this. They were grateful for the things that they had, and they were willing to tithe to prove that they were very grateful with Adonai. So I don't teach, and we here at Kehilah Derek Shuba, we do not teach the tithe of the Levite or any of this. Or as a matter of fact, no one is forced to even tithe, right? It is something that Adonai would put in their heart to do, to give. And if it's a 10% rule they want to follow and call it a tithe, call it a ma'aser, well, that's fine. Some people that Adonai has blessed, if they want to follow a double tithe, they can do 20%, or they can do 5%, or they can figure it out however they want to figure it out. I think the point here is not the percentage, but how grateful are you for what Adonai gives you, right? Yaakov seemed to think that 10% was fair enough, and that is the rule that he was going to follow. So now he leaves Bethel and he makes it to Haran. In Haran, he will meet Rachel, and through Rachel, he meets her father, Lavan, his uncle. And Yaakov makes a deal to work 7 years to receive Rachel as payment. And Lavan, after the 7 years, realizes he is very blessed, and that Yaakov has been a great blessing to his household. So he wants to keep him. And what he devises to do is to give him Leah, his oldest daughter, in marriage, which would then force Yaakov to work an additional 7 years for him to receive the daughter he actually wanted, Rachel. Now, Lavan, in a way, therefore, is responsible for Yaakov starting to have more than one wife, right? Yaakov came for Rachel. He could have got Rachel and he'd be a happy man. But he ended up with two due to a trick from Lavan. Later on, because Rachel could not have children, she gave Yaakov Bilhah, her servant, as a surrogate mother to have children through her. And now Yaakov had three, right? 3 wives, you can say. And then Leah does the same thing with Zilpah, and then he ends up with 4. And it all started really because of Lavan. Had it not been because of Lavan, Yaakov would have had the exact same situation as his father and his grandfather. Let's see the pattern. Yaakov married Sarah, she was barren, and through a miracle, eventually she had Yitzhak. Yitzhak married Rivka, she was barren, and through a miracle, she bore Esav and Yaakov. And now, had Yaakov directly married Rachel, she would have also been barren, and eventually, in due time, due to a miracle, she would have conceived and given birth to Joseph and Benjamin. Now, right, this is all speculation. However, Lavan sets off the chain of events that will cause Yaakov to have 4 wives. So now we have Yaakov has 4 wives, and he's ready to leave. He's been working for Lavan for 20 years. He's been tending for 6 years Lavan's flock, and during this time, Lavan has consistently tried to defraud Yaakov. We have Yaakov saying, Lavan changed my wages 100 times. So the deal that Lavan and Yaakov made was that Lavan would give Yaakov all of his spotted sheep. And let's just say that 10% of the sheep were spotted. So Yaakov was to take these 10% of the spotted sheep and start his own flock. Presumably, those spotted animals would produce more spotted animals, and those offspring would belong to Yaakov. And in this way, he would amass sheep for himself. However, right from the get-go, Lavan defrauded him, and he stole from Yaakov. What he did was he took the spotted sheep, those 10% of the flock, and he gave them to his son and removed them a 3 days distance. Now Yaakov had to begin his own flock with 0 animals, with all solidly colored sheep. Yaakov tried to, when he saw this, he devised an idea that he would peel the bark. He would take branches, he would peel the bark to expose the cambium layer, the white part of the branch, thinking that perhaps the sheep would see the spotted branches and mate to produce spotted animals. We see Yaakov probably did this out of desperation. He saw that in order for himself to build a flock, starting from scratch, starting from 0 would be a lot of hard work. And I'm sure he didn't want to start any conflicts with Lavan, so he just took it. And he tried to do what was in his power. And really there's a big lesson for us there, because there's a lot of Lavans in the world, and Lavans that we can run into. And we need to learn from this Parasha that what Yaakov did was trying to solve the problem using his own brains, using his own instincts, using his own intelligence. And because he was righteous, we see that Adonai was behind the plan. As a matter of fact, later on we read where Adonai tells Yaakov, in a dream he tells him, look around, it is only the spotted males that are breeding, producing the spotted offspring. And it was Adonai causing it. Adonai was behind it all along. The sticks had nothing to do with it. And what we learn is Adonai telling Yaakov, you could have not even done the sticks. I was going to bless you because I saw what Lavan did to you, right? I saw what Lavan did to you. Therefore, depending on Adonai would have been the best thing to do. Let us go now to talk a little more. We'll talk a little bit more about Lavan. The reason is that the unfairness of Lavan surrounds us in this world of darkness that we live in. If we do business with 10 people out in the world that do not keep Torah, at least 9 will be Lavan. At least 9 will try to take advantage, will try to defraud, will try to stack the deck, like they say, in their favor. And they will try to cover they will look out for their best interest first, and then you, right? And this is Lavan. They will change the deal. Why is there so many lawsuits? Why is there so many lawsuits with business partners going after each other and all of these things? It's because someone defrauded someone else. You don't sue someone if things are going great and if they treat you fairly. A lawsuit usually reflects unfair treatment, some sort of unfair situation that the person who was defrauded feels that they need to be recompensed. Therefore, if the people of the world that don't study Torah are Lavan, what must we be? Those of us that study Torah, those of us that consider ourselves part of Am Israel, what is a good guideline for us? Where can we find those guidelines? And to answer that question, I would like to go to Psalm chapter 15. It is a great psalm because it answers this question. It says as follows. A psalm by David. Adonai, who may sojourn in your tent? Who may dwell on your holy mountain? And so this is the question David is asking. Who can be in Adonai's tent? In his Yishkan? Who can dwell? Who can come close to Adonai? What kind of man? What kind of person? And then he goes to answer the question. And we'll see that the answers to the question is everything opposite of Lavan. Verse 2 says, one who walks in perfect innocence and does what is right and speaks the truth from his heart. So, someone who does what is right and speaks the truth from his heart, what does that mean? It means that if we conduct business and someone wants to buy something from us, for example, we'll tell them the true price. We'll tell them what is wrong with the thing we're selling, right? If you're selling a vehicle and someone says, oh, okay, what do you want for this vehicle? And you answer $5,000. Anything wrong with it? And you say, oh, nothing at all, nothing at all. As a matter of fact, it's worth $10,000, but I'm being generous and I'm selling it for $5,000. Perhaps the car is only worth $2,500 and perhaps the transmission is bad. But Lavan would try to sell it for $5,000 and say nothing is wrong with it. Someone who keeps Torah, like David HaMelech here, a psalm by David, Psalm 15, he would say, a man who speaks truth from his heart, which means that he would not defraud the person. He would tell them what is wrong with the vehicle. He would say the truth. Someone who is not constantly, for his own gain, lying or deceiving. Right? This is what we see in Lavan. So those of us that keep Torah, we have to be very honest in how we deal with people. We have to make sure we do not deceive people, that we do not lie to them. Why is this important? It all goes back to the idea of us being the representatives of Adonai, those who keep Torah. And sadly, it could be those who wear tzitziot and they shout from the rooftops that they keep Shabbat, they are Shomer Shabbat, they keep Torah, they eat kosher, they have all of these positives, right? And it only takes one time for them to defraud someone to give everyone who keeps Torah a bad name. Because then people will think, oh yeah, that person that wears the tzitziot, yeah, he defrauded me when he sold me that car, he lied to me. That car wasn't worth $2,000 and he sold it for sold it to me for $5,000, right? And from then on, that person will have a bad taste in his mouth every time he sees someone wearing tzitziot. Wearing his tzitzit, he will say, oh, people like him, they defraud you. Happened to me last year, right? And you leave people, instead of them wanting to know more about the Torah, we're giving the Torah a bad name. Now, if we do the opposite, if people deal with us and we say the truth, we are honest, perhaps they may say, hey, why are you so honest? You could have defrauded me. I know nothing about cars. You could have said it was worth $10,000 and I would have believed you. Why did you tell me the truth? What is wrong with this car? If your answer is because I studied Torah and we're supposed to be honest, perhaps that person might want to know more about the Torah. Perhaps he might say, these aren't people that just preach. These are people that practice what they preach. These are people that walk the Torah. And it resonates the words of Rav Shaul in the book of Romans when he says in chapter 2, it is not the hearers of the Torah who are righteous, right? Justified before Adonai. It is the doers of Torah. And these are these are the ways that we become doers of Torah. But let's continue in Psalm 15. Verse 3 says, who has no slander on his tongue, who has done his fellow no evil, nor cast disgrace upon his close one. So this is how we talk about people, how we deal with people, what we say about people. Slander. What is slander? A lot of times we refer to this as lashon hara, right? The evil tongue. Slandering people, saying falsehoods about people, worrying about other people. And now this brings back the words of Yeshua. And Yeshua very wisely said that the people who are unjust, in this case the Pharisees of his time, he says, you look at the speck in your brother's eye and you have a log in your own eye. And this is what slanderous people do. They go around, right, looking for defects in people and slandering them and talking to other people about them, saying, hey, did you hear what this brother said or what he did? Do you notice that this person always shows up late? Do you notice that this person doesn't eat kosher? He eats certain things that wouldn't be correct to eat. He eats meat from any store, whatever may be the case. People who enjoy slandering or who slander are not people that will sojourn with Adonai, that will sojourn in his tent, because they're too worried looking at the defects of others and not looking at their own. And so we have a person who does his fellow no evil, nor cast disgrace on his close one. So don't make people look bad. Don't do evil to people, right? If Lavan had known this, if Lavan was like David who wrote this psalm, he would not have done to Yaakov what he did. It was his relative. Yet he did evil to his close one. He did evil to his relative. Let's continue. Verse 4. In whose eyes a contemptible person is repulsive, but who honors those who fear Adonai, who can swear to his detriment without retracting. So in whose eyes a person who doesn't keep Torah is repulsive. Now, someone who keeps Torah, we have to be very careful that we do not give more honor to a person of the world with a high status in the world than a person of the community, of the synagogue, or of the Bet Knesset, of the Keilah, who is lowly. Let me give you an example. If you have a night open where you can invite someone to dinner, and it could be the businessman next door, the person who has connections, the person who has money, the person who could benefit you, The person who you might want to be on his good side in order to receive some benefit. But he's of the world. He could care less about the Torah. As a matter of fact, he's told you before, don't really care about the Torah. I don't even believe in God. And you have the person at the Bet Knesset, at the synagogue, at the Keilah, who sweeps, can barely read, but he tries to keep Torah. Not the most knowledgeable in Torah, but he does his best. And he's the guy that sweeps. If you have one steak dinner to invite someone to, and you would rather invite the Rasha, the person who is wicked, but because they're good businessmen in the world, and because they could help you in your business, or they can help you in some way or another, you would invite them to eat that steak, as opposed to the righteous person who can barely read, then you're the opposite of Psalm 15. You are more like Lavan, not like David. Not like Yaakov, not like the people who keep Torah. It says here, in whose eyes a contemptible person is repulsive, right? That means that no matter how much a person of the world can benefit you, if they spit on the Torah, if they tell you to your face that they don't believe in God, that they're atheists, you treat them repulsively, right? Because they are insulting the things that we value the most, right? But a person like Lavan, who is looking for his best business interest, for his best monetary interest, and that's all that is in his mind, even if he thinks he keeps Torah, then he himself is another Lavan, right? He himself is just looking to gain. So, Psalm 15, a person who keeps Torah will honor those who keep Torah first. Those who keep Torah first. The second part says, who can swear to his detriment without retracting. That means someone who keeps Torah should be able to give someone their word and keep it. Even if it's to their own detriment, like it says here, their own detriment. What does that mean? I'll give you an example. I think an example is good here. If my grandfather left me as an inheritance a watch, an old watch, I never use it, right? And one day someone sees that watch and says, I'd like to buy that watch from you. I like old watches. Sell it to me. And you say, well, I don't know how much that old thing is worth, but can't be worth more than $100. Give me $100 for it. And the person says, not a problem. I don't have the money now. I will come back tomorrow and give you the $100. Now, in the meantime, if you research the value of the watch, and you find out the watch is worth $10,000. It is a collectible. It is an antique worth $10,000. The person comes back, the buyer comes back next day and says, here's your $100. What does the person who keeps Torah, what should they do? And what would Lavan do? Right? The person who keeps Torah will accept the $100 and give him the watch because he gave him his word. That was the deal. He would not change the deal. Lavan would go back on his deal 100 times. He will find all kinds of excuses or flat out refuse to give him the watch unless he gives him $8,000 for it, $9,000 maybe, right? And that's what Lavan would do. But a person who keeps Torah, a man of Torah, you said you would do something, you made a deal, you keep the deal, even to your own detriment. That's the point. Even when the deal will harm you, you will not change your word. How did Lavan break this principle here? Because he told Yaakov, the spotted sheep can be yours. And immediately he changed his mind. And as Adonai would bless Yaakov, and the animals would start to produce spotted sheep, suddenly Lavan would change his mind and say, okay, never mind. I now want the spotted sheep because the sheep are producing spotted sheep. What's going on? I want those now. Yaakov, the striped sheep will now be yours. Or the black-headed sheep will now be yours. And all of a sudden, the sheep would start producing striped and black-headed sheep. And then Lavan would see that and he would immediately change his mind and say, okay, now those are mine. And Adonai would slowly started to take away Lavan's flock and give it to Yaakov in that way. But Lavan tried his hardest. Lavan tried his hardest to change the deal to his own benefit. We'll continue reading. Who lends not his money on interest and takes not a bribe against the innocent. The doer of these shall not falter forever. Not taking interest, not taking bribes. Big, as a matter of fact, those are mitzvot, right? These are actually mitzvot in the Torah, not to take a neshech, right? So we have the two mitzvot in the Torah here, not to take neshech and not to take shochad, right? Not to take interest and not to take bribe. So a righteous person will lend to someone who needs it. Well, let's put it to you this way. Lending money. It is not the rich or the well-off that will ask you to borrow money, right? They have their own. It is usually the poor, the destitute, those that are going through a hard time that will ask for money, to be lent money. And the Torah teaches us not to take advantage of those people, right? If they're in a position to ask for money, of course, we should have compassion on them. And if you're going to lend money to them, you will lend it on zero interest, which means, again, you're being selfless. Not like Lavan. Lavan was selfish. The Torah, and here David, teaches us not to be selfish, to be selfless, to be able to help someone in the community, right? Because someone could think, if someone in the community needs to borrow $5,000 and you let them borrow $5,000, the businessman, Lavan, he would say, wait a minute, if it takes 3 years for him to pay me, I can invest that somewhere where I can make 5% interest on my money. What if I let this poor guy borrow the $5,000, he'll pay me back $5,000, I won't collect interest, and I lose potential gain. Potential gain. You know, that doesn't really make sense to the business person, the person who thinks that their money should be earning them interest, should be earning them more money. And so here we have David saying, no, the righteous person will lend to those in need without interest, and also will not take a bribe, right? Will not take something in benefit to harm an innocent person. Anyway, it says the doer of these shall not falter forever. And I found it important this year maybe to touch this subject, because as those of us, as we learn more Torah, and those of us that are coming, are new to Torah, we may be carrying bad habits. We may still like to speak lie, to say half-truths, to say things to benefit ourselves, to step on whoever you need to step on in order to get ahead in life. And these are things that we have to leave behind. These are things that we see in this Parasha, Lavan, who didn't keep Torah, right? We see him practicing these bad habits. Sadly, Lavan came from the same ancestor as Abraham, as Yitzhak and Yaakov, right? Terach was the ancestor of all of them. Yet, Lavan's family decided to stay behind, and Abraham decided to follow Adonai. And we can see that the choice to stay behind in Haran, by the time you get to Lavan, you see that he wasn't a very righteous person. Was not a very righteous person. Even so, they were better than the Canaanites, that's for sure. This is why the patriarchs would go back to marry people from their own family, because they were still better than the Canaanites. And we see that the Canaanites were terrible people. Adonai warned the Israelites many times not to behave like the Canaanites, who practiced abominable practices. Now I would like to move over to Genesis chapter 31, verse 38. And here we have Yaakov addressing Lavan. Yaakov is now left with his wives and his children and his flocks. And Lavan catches up to him. And they have a meeting. And here is what Yaakov tells Lavan. It says, "These 20 years I have been with you. Your ewes and your she-goats never miscarried, nor did I eat rams of your flock. That which was mangled I never brought you. I myself would bear the loss. From me you would exact it, whether it was stolen by day or stolen by night. This is how I was. By day, scorching heat consumed me, and frost by night. My sleep drifted from my eyes. this is my 20 years in your household. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flocks. And you changed my wage 100 times. Had not the God of my father, the God of Abraham, the dread of Yitzhak, been with me, you would surely have now sent me away empty-handed. God saw my wretchedness and the toil of my hands, so he admonished you last night. And here we have Yaakov, 20 years later. He's on his way out and he recognizes that the God who appeared to him at Bethel certainly had been with him these 20 years, and that he had protected him from Lavan, that he had given him everything that he now had because of the God of his grandfather Abraham and his father Yitzhak. And this is very important that we ourselves look back and recognize that it is Adonai that has brought us to where we are at all times. That we don't see Yaakov saying, and it is because I was clever and I made cuts and sticks and manipulated the genetics of the flock in such a way that I could have or take your flocks. We don't see Yaakov saying this. We see that he understands that everything came from Adonai, that Adonai was in control, that it was Adonai who had blessed him. It wasn't the sticks. He doesn't credit the sticks. He credits Adonai directly. And this is a trait that we all should have as followers of Torah. The last thing I'd like to cover is the covenant towards the end of the Parasha. Lavan and Yaakov make a covenant, and they have 2 names there, which is very interesting because somehow Lavan and Yaakov are speaking to each other, so they speak the same language, right? Yet they call the place something different. And we see Lavan speaking Aramaic. And this is perhaps the first time that we have Aramaic being recorded in Hebrew. And verse 47, we'll just read it. It says, Lavan called it, we'll just leave it in Hebrew. It says, Vayikra lo Lavan Yegar Sahaduta. Vayakov kara lo Galed. What does that mean? It says that Lavan called the place Yegar Sahaduta. Presumably this is from the word ed, which would be witness. And because Lavan said this pile of stones will be a witness. So it's a similar word concept to Hebrew. But we see Yaakov calling the place Gal Ed, right? Gal Ed. So a pile as a witness, or a witness pile would be a better translation. And we have Aramaic. There are some Aramaic scriptures, and there are translations that come from Aramaic. I always like to say that the more Hebrew, the better, because we know that the descendants of Eber, the Hebrews, they spoke Hebrew. And the original language, you can say, of the patriarchs was indeed Hebrew. Presumably then, Lavan learned Aramaic in Aram Naharaim, right? The Arameans spoke Aramaic. And so now we have him speaking Aramaic. Perhaps he also spoke Hebrew. But I don't like to rely on the Aramaic writings. If we have the Hebrew writings, then why rely on the Aramaic? So the more Hebrew, the better. And while we're in the topic of languages, there are also translations, for example, the Septuagint, which are in Greek. And again, although the Septuagint is an ancient Bible translation, which is in Greek, again, the Hebrew source is better. Now, just a quick note about the Septuagint, right? And the Greek translation is, when we read the writings of the disciples, the Ketuvim Talmidim of Yeshua, sometimes we see certain details there in the writings that tell us that perhaps they were reading the Septuagint at that time, as well as the Targumim. So not to say that they don't have their place, the Septuagint, the Greek translations, and the Aramaic, they don't have their place in us studying the scriptures as a whole, but just as a rule of thumb, for me, the more Hebrew, the better. We'll finish with saying this. We see in this Parasha, Yaakov leaving the land of Israel and also returning, right? Parasha Vayetse, we track the 20 years of Yaakov as he leaves the promised land, and then as he comes back, he arrives there with nothing and he leaves with much. 4 wives, 13 children, many flocks, servants, right? Camels, and he comes back a very rich man, all because of the blessing of Adonai. He runs into his uncle who tricks him and who changes his wages. But we learn perhaps the most valuable lesson of them all, which is regardless of how many Lavans we can deal with, if Adonai is behind our plan, if we are in the path of Adonai, if he has blessed our path, then no amount of Lavan can harm us. Amen. Shabbat Shalom.